Decisions, decisions, decisions. Good grief, we have so many decisions to make. Agonize over those choices. Decisions that seem so large, especially in the wee hours of the night. It can feel like life or death. And sure, those big tent-pole decisions create the architecture of our lives. But really, when it comes right down to it, the decisions that are a matter of life or death, those are often made in a split second. We see it all the time in true crime. All these people with all of those big plans, and how one spontaneous decision can change everything forever. And in tonight's episode, you'll hear about how two young women each made a split-second decision, but with two starkly different outcomes. And the only reason why we know about this particular story of these two women is because of Keith Morrison, Dateline's iconic correspondent, and a decision he made nearly 60 years ago. A decision that would change his life forever and chart the future of true crime. I'm Nancy Miller, and this is Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime, with the third installment of Keith Morrison Month, who just turned 78. And I chose this story because out of the hundreds and hundreds of Dateline episodes, of the thousands of people Keith Morrison has interviewed, out of all of the murder cases Keith has covered on Dateline over the past 30 years, there are just certain stories and certain people Keith never forgets. This is one of those stories. A dark, strange, and disturbing saga of two young women who shared a grim connection. A murder mystery that really would come down to decisions made in a millisecond. A series of events that began in April of 2011. An episode called Deadly Connection that Keith has said all these years later, it still stays with him. And the reason why? It might surprise you. Because what happened, it surprised everyone, including Keith. Now, as always, this is the Dead Sleep version, which means I've written it with plenty of unique details that tire one's mind, all while eliding some of the graphic violence, 911 calls, and of course, no ads for optimized listening. And I made that choice when I started this show in 2023, that this show would be ad-free, to have a great experience for you and for me. And while it's a harder road, I stand by the decision. Because I feel strongly that this show doesn't work with advertising. And I feel confident that if people really like something, they will decide to support it and be happy about that decision. And so if you like this show and you want to support it, you can do so through Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Patreon. And again, I do most of this show myself. It's really small and really niche, but your support, it really means a lot. And you can get that free month on Apple Podcasts or a free 7-day trial on Patreon. Check out links in the show notes or search for Dead Sleep on those platforms. And of course, this month of July is special because Keith Morrison is who inspired this podcast in the first place. And it's strange to think, if he'd made a different decision over 50 years ago, back when Keith Morrison was barely 20 years old, growing up in a small town in the Canadian province of Saskatchewan, well, we wouldn't have Dateline, we wouldn't have this podcast, and we would not have the quality of true crime as we know it today. And in fact, Keith would say It was remarkable that he even became a reporter in the first place. By his own account, he wasn't much of a go-getter. When he was in school, he barely studied. He preferred extracurriculars, most especially sleeping in instead of going to class. Keith was one of 5 children. Not the oldest or the youngest, not the smartest or the cutest, just a blur of a boy, somewhere in the middle. And while some reports say Keith dropped out of college in Saskatchewan, to hear Keith tell it, he didn't quit exactly. It was more like he was invited to leave. The dean could tell Keith was a smart kid. Just needed some growing up to do. Maybe take a break, the dean said, and come back when you're ready. But ready for what? Keith didn't know. His father was a minister at the local church in Keith's small town. And through his preacher father's rousing sermons, he learned the power of good storytelling and how to speak directly to someone. Treat them like they're someone you respect and you like. Make someone feel like you see them in a crowd full of hundreds, thousands of people. And Keith witnessed, through his father firsthand, how those in the church pews, strangers, did connect through the power of story. Now, his mother was in the church choir, and she was an excellent singer who taught Keith how to approach storytelling like a song. Later, Keith would engage audiences with his rhythmic cadence and emotive inflection. But Keith, he was no preacher, and he learned that early on, when a member of the congregation had lost her husband, and Keith's father was out of town and asked Keith if he could please stop by and pay his respects on behalf of his father and the church. The town Keith grew up in was rural, lots of farmland, with a tight-knit community of people who kept emotions buried deep and rarely turned over that soil. But much to Keith's surprise and quiet horror, when he went to the woman's house to comfort her about the loss of her husband, this woman, who was much, much older than Keith, turned to him for answers and for comfort. Keith was stunned and a little scared. He was barely 20 years old. What did he know about death? And what did she think he knew about death? This woman trusted him by association, a proxy for his father, and he felt strange about this. Keith had no clue what to say. He hadn't experienced any deep loss, but he managed to stick around and said something, offered comfort. But who would want to make a career out of this? Showing up at people's worst moments, bearing witness to so much grief and pain. This woman lost her husband. He wasn't coming back. What could Keith, or anyone really, do to change that? Nothing. Keith had some odd jobs here and there, but nothing stuck, not really, until Keith stumbled his way into a job at a local newspaper called the Star Phoenix in Saskatoon, the biggest city in the province of Saskatchewan. This was the late 60s, early 1970s, an era where newspaper reporters were becoming like rock stars. Sharp elbows and big names, like Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. It was a tumultuous but exciting time for a young reporter. Keith did grunt work at first, running errands and driving his boss around, then little assignments here and there to sharpen his reporting skills. And it was around this time his editor gave him one of his earliest assignments. His editor told him he needed to go out and speak with a woman who'd just lost her husband, another widow. Only the story this time, Keith learned, was even more bleak. This woman's husband was a crossing guard who'd been fatally struck by a car that sped right into him. The newspaper editor told Keith they needed some quotes from this widow, and Keith needed to go over there to her house, knock on her front door, and get some quotes. The last thing he wanted to do was have to knock on someone's door and ask them all kinds of probing and personal questions about a person they'd lost only hours ago. But his boss, a veteran newspaper editor who liked his reporters the way he liked his liquor, fast acting and neat. He needed these quotes to fill in the story. So let's get a move on. And in his gruff voice, he gave Keith a little tip. Most people, they like to talk. He didn't want to be disrespectful or come off like a ghoul. So he had to make a choice. Was he going to go over there and knock on that woman's door and risk having it slammed in his face, or worse? Or was he going to say no, walk away, and try something else? He was on deadline. He didn't have much time to decide. And he didn't really have anything else. If he wanted to be a reporter, he'd have to learn how to ask difficult questions and have doors slammed in his face. He went to the door. And he knocked. And when the widow opened the door, he could tell, of course, that she'd been crying. But when he said he was a reporter and he was here to talk about what happened, about her husband, she didn't slam the door in his face. Instead, she invited him in. And she sat this young man down for tea and biscuits. And his cranky old editor was right. Most people, they like to talk. She didn't specifically talk about what happened, but she talked about her husband and who he was and what he meant to her. And it was that day that Keith Morrison, he had a glimmer of what his life as a reporter might be. That he wasn't a preacher, he wasn't there to comfort someone. He was there to listen, to take in someone's story, to be a vessel for the truth. Keith was a conduit who took in what someone had to say and found a way to share their story with the world. Now, all that happened years ago, and what happened to that man, it was an accident, as far as anyone knew, not murder. But that day, that was the day Keith Morrison made his choice. An in-the-moment decision that would mark the first step down the long and winding path and into the deep and darkest alleys to become the greatest of true crime of all time. Of course, there were many jobs in between. And we learned a bit about Keith in the 1970s and 80s and the 90s in the previous episode. And how he'd started at Dateline around 1994. And at that time, Dateline was a news magazine where he did all kinds of stories. Silly, like exercising with Jack LaLanne. But most were serious. Big, heavy-hitting stories happening all over the world. And in those stories, Keith traveled to places like Indonesia, where he found himself just after Christmas in 2004, when a massive 9.2 magnitude earthquake, called an undersea megathrust earthquake somewhere in the depths of the Indian Ocean, triggered a tsunami with waves as high as 100 feet. That's the size of a 10-story building. A wave that swept away hundreds of thousands of people, with roughly 170,000 people losing their lives in Indonesia alone. Keith would later remember the horrific scale of it all, including the removal and the burning of thousands of corpses. Not long after that, Keith reported a Dateline story on the child soldiers in northern Uganda. Kids who were 8, 10 years old and were recruited and indoctrinated into the killing of others by a ruthless warlord named Joseph Kony, a religious zealot with a messiah complex who wanted to turn Uganda into a theocracy. Though his actions were abhorrent and unholy, forcing children to join his terrorist organization, and in some instances, forced to kill members of their own families. For that work, Keith was nominated for an Emmy, which he won in 2006. But that same year, in 2006, things were changing at Dateline. From covering global atrocities to digging deep into small-town murder mysteries. It's well known that Keith was deeply conflicted about this shift. Covering global conflicts that were happening right now. That was crucial journalism, helping people better understand the world, bringing attention to an issue that might help in some way forge change. What the powers that be were now suggesting was taking real-life tragedies and retelling them as entertaining murder mysteries. Something about that didn't feel right. Was it wrong? But the veteran team of producers assured Keith that this new iteration of Dateline, one driven by true crime, would still adhere to the same journalistic rigor as all the other work did. And it's true. Dateline's ethical guidelines, from the very beginning, were crucial in gaining the trust of subjects on the show and the viewers watching at home. And the three most important Dateline rules are as follows. Number 1. Dateline only sits down and interviews subjects who want to be interviewed. No ambushing survivors or family members or alleged perpetrators, with a few noteworthy exceptions. So consent in the participation of family members, especially in these murder cases, it's essential for a Dateline story. And like any reputable news outlet, Dateline doesn't pay for interviews with subjects, including victims' families, cops, or the accused. Number 2. Dateline episodes are never open-ended. They have to have a resolution, usually in the court of law, where it's decided if a perpetrator is guilty or not guilty. And the wheels of justice move slowly, which is why some Dateline episodes can take years of reporting to complete. Number 3. Correspondents like Keith Morrison, along with Josh Mankiewicz and the others, they do the key interviews themselves. And in the case of Keith Morrison, Keith is afforded all of the time that he needs, which has led some interviews to run over 5 hours. So with those guidelines in place, Keith could be confident that this new era of Dateline would allow him to do what he did best, focus on the people, and let the story flow through him. Keith Morrison, true crime conduit. Besides, what else was Keith going to do? At that time, Keith was around 60 years old, and the whole media landscape was changing. Cable news was crowded, and new websites like YouTube were beginning to disrupt the whole notion of television altogether. Keith had been around long enough to know that if you wanted to stay alive in this brutal business, you had to adapt. So Keith adapted, and he told stories, incredible, jaw-dropping stories, and he was good at it. Maybe a little too good. Because one Saturday night, when Keith was innocently at home in Los Angeles, his whole world, life as he knew it, came crashing down. It all started with a text message late at night. The text was from one of Keith Morrison's daughters. So late at night, one could only wonder what was wrong. She told him there was something on television he needed to see. Keith turned on the television, and on screen was a man, a horrific ghoul, who was interviewing people about horrible things, terrible murders, and cackling with pleasure. The man, he was grotesque. And that man, it was Keith. Or at least it was supposed to be. It was an episode of Saturday Night Live. Bill Hader doing his now famous impression of the Dateline correspondent, wearing a white wig and a sly smile, eyes brimming with delight every single time someone talked about someone dying. The effect was hilarious and creepy. And while Keith has been nothing but gracious in public, especially with Bill Hader, that time when it happened, he didn't know what to think. It was flattering and humbling. Bill Hader appeared to be the embodiment of everything Keith Morrison was desperately trying not to be. Here he thought he could do real journalism, that he could bring something to true crime. But here it was. And he'd later say that he felt like an idiot, and discovered that day he'd been an idiot all along. Keith's judgment of himself was far harsher than anyone else's. He could only hope that people would still take him seriously. Was his credibility ruined? When comedian Gilda Radner impersonated Barbara Walters on SNL decades earlier, they'd made fun of her speech impediment, and it took her years to embrace that impersonation because it wasn't going away. Keith would eventually have to do the same thing. Of course, we now know Bill Hader's SNL moment only enhanced Keith's image. Keith was the most beloved, most watched Dateline correspondent, and in a world of sound bites and quick hits, Dateline episodes were getting even longer. And the demand for true crime gaining traction. And for Keith, this meant more stories and more interviews. And if Keith was indeed like an empty vessel where the stories of the dead flowed through him, it was only natural that in time Keith was bound to feel a little corroded. Because every Dateline story was different and yet somehow, so often, the same. In his global reporting, like in Uganda, people killed because they had no choice. It was either kill or be killed. But in these Dateline stories, people, they killed because they wanted to. And too often, it was men who felt entitled to it, and so certain they would get away with it. Because so often, too often, they did. July 5th, 2011, in the wee hours of the morning, when it's darkest, just before the dawn. As a young woman awoke in her bedroom, trying to figure out what was happening. It was hard to know what woke her up first. Was it the smell of smoke filling her lungs, or the noxious sting of freshly poured bleach burning through her nostrils? Or was it the agony of sustaining horrific injuries? Whatever the case, whatever it was, the woman knew she had to get out of this place. An apartment located on the second floor of a perfectly nice building in Fort Collins, Colorado, was now a blazing inferno. And the woman, alone in that apartment, she had two choices. Either stay here, in this blaze, and most certainly die, or try and leap out of a window, and maybe she'd make it. There wasn't time for second thoughts, only hope for a second chance. She jumped. By then, the fire was big enough that neighbors had called 911. Fire trucks had arrived, as did an ambulance. And whether it was adrenaline or terror or a mix of both, somehow the woman found her way to that ambulance, and they rushed her to the hospital as fast as they could. As medics tried to treat her injuries, it was hard to know what had happened. The severity of the trauma to her body looked like she'd been hit by a bus, but they couldn't ask her what happened. Her jaw was completely shattered. And once at the hospital, things got even worse. When this woman suffered a massive stroke, which stopped the blood flowing to her brain. The woman was soon airlifted from that hospital in Fort Collins to a hospital in Denver, where a medical team assessed her injuries, which were literally head to toe, and realized their only course of action was to induce a coma. It wasn't a question of how long she'd be in that coma. It was a question of if she would even survive. And it wasn't looking good. Somewhere along the way, they managed to find out this woman's name, Lydia Tillman. And they managed to track down her family, including her sister Esther, who rushed to the hospital in Denver to be by her sister's side. Only when she got there, she had no idea who that woman was. They said it was her sister, but she looked nothing like the Lydia she knew. Lydia Tillman was 30 years old, a popular, well-traveled wine sales rep for a Colorado-based natural wine distributor. She was a shiny person, from her shiny personality to her long, brown, shiny hair. This was not Lydia. This battered and broken person, whose face was so swollen it was unrecognizable. This wasn't Lydia. The only way she was able to really believe it was her sister was when she had an opportunity to check her ankle. Near Lydia's ankle was a tattoo. And when she peeled back the sheet and looked at this woman's ankle, there it was. It was undeniable. Someone had done this to her sister. But Esther and the whole Tillman family, they didn't have time to think about who did it. They were dedicating all of their energy towards making sure Lydia survived. And Lydia was going to need all the help she could get. The same could be said for a detective named Jackie Shackley. As Detective Shackley stood at the so-called crime scene, which was really now just a burned-out apartment, smoke and cinder blocks. Firefighters had done their best to put out the flames, but the damage to the building and her apartment was catastrophic. The heat was so great it melted all of the appliances and fixtures. How could an investigation begin? How could one even start to put the puzzle pieces together when someone's whole existence had been set ablaze, reduced to ashes? Whoever this was wanted to obliterate Lydia off of the face of the earth. So the first question was, who could hate Lydia this much? Detective Shackley followed the typical narrative. A pretty popular girl goes out on a date, and it goes wrong. And the person who did do this had tried to destroy all the evidence. What the fire didn't destroy, copious amounts of liquid bleach likely did. Liquid bleach was doused all over the bedroom where the attack took place. And liquid bleach is a dilute solution of an alkaline inorganic chemical compound called sodium hypochlorite. And it is one of the only compounds capable of destroying, annihilating DNA. With so little to go on, it meant that the only DNA they had, out of the entire crime scene, was what was found on Lydia herself. A smattering, trace amounts of genetic material, skin cells, from under Lydia's fingernails. That material was already sent to a lab, but the results would take days, assuming results came back at all. Material found under the fingernails is the most vulnerable kind of genetic material, the most at risk for cross-contamination. And you might recall we learned a bit about cross-contamination in an earlier episode of this podcast called A Killer's Touch. When a man was wrongfully accused of murder, when his DNA was found under the fingernails of a victim. Fortunately, it was discovered that this man was innocent and that the DNA under the victim's fingernails was from DNA transfer. These two men hadn't known each other. What would be critical in this case with Lydia and her attacker was the amount of biological material. And the amount under someone's fingernails, it's hard to know. It's the surface area, of course, but it's also the amount of pressure, how hard someone's fingernails go into someone's skin. That pressure can be measured in pounds. And 2 pounds of pressure, it may not sound like much, but it's asking a lot of someone in the midst of a surprise attack. One could only hope that somehow Lydia had the wherewithal to apply enough pressure into this person's skin and drag her nails down to collect a decent sample. But of course, it was no guarantee. But it would turn out the most important clue. It came with an O. Henry-style true crime twist. That the very thing her assailant had used to destroy evidence, that's a lot of liquid bleach, would turn out to be the key connection between her attacker and a missing persons case from 3 months earlier. That person apparently missing was also a young woman with long brown hair. She was 19-year-old Kenya Monhay. And she went missing sometime after midnight on April Fool's Day and hadn't been seen since. That was 3 months ago, and the missing persons case was now presumably a murder case. Denver authorities were intrigued by a 31-year-old man who'd insinuated himself into that case early on. His name was Travis Forbes. He was a blonde-haired, blue-eyed, crunchy New Age guy who had his own business making and selling gluten-free granola bars. Not long after Kenya had gone missing, Travis had got in touch with Kenya's father. And he told Kenya's father he was racked with guilt, that he'd seen Kenya that night, alone, and offered to give her a ride in his white delivery van, the one he used to make granola bar drop-offs. But that night, when they'd made a pit stop to get gas, Kenya, it seemed, ran into someone she knew. And she took off. Travis had assumed she would be okay, but then he heard that she'd gone missing, and he felt compelled to come forward to share what he knew. Kenya's stepfather, as well as the police, were a little suspicious of this wild story. But he seemed nice and cooperative. That is, until police had the opportunity to inspect the inside of that white delivery van. And instantly, they were hit with the smell of bleach that felt as sharp as a slap. Something very, very bad had happened here. Since then, Denver detectives did their damnedest to connect Travis to Kenya. And everything kept coming back to that bleach. Interviews with Travis's ex-girlfriends revealed he had long had this thing for bleach, obsessively cleaning everything so it smelled like bleach. But this clue, or rather this M.O., it was affirming, but wasn't necessarily evidence. Their best hope was still for that smidge of DNA from Lydia. And if that DNA did prove to be Travis, they could hopefully track him down, wherever he was, before he struck again. Back at the hospital, surrounded by her family, Lydia was still in a coma. Her family wasn't sure if Lydia would ever wake up, and if and when she did, what kind of condition she would be in. She'd suffered so much trauma, including some serious brain damage from that stroke and other injuries. The only thing they could do was stay by her side and talk to her, urging her to hang on, that she was going to be okay, that she was going to make it, and that somehow these words of love and hope would have some type of effect, a healing balm on her brain. All the while bracing themselves for the possibility that someday very soon, the final words to Lydia would be their goodbyes. Meanwhile, detectives were also bracing themselves that this missing persons case would soon be revealed as a double murder case. Somewhere out there in a distant criminal lab, technicians worked around the clock for days, rigorously testing the sample of DNA, clusters of millions of cells that held the key to cracking this case. And when they sent the results back to Detective Shackley, there was indeed a match. The DNA under Lydia's fingernails belonged to Travis Forbes. Now, there's much more to the story, but ultimately, authorities were able to arrest Travis Forbes and charge him with the attempted murder on Lydia Tillman. But could they get Travis to confess to the murder of 19-year-old Kenya? It would be a painstakingly long process of several months as Travis weighed his decision. Did he want to confess to what he'd done? Did he want to reveal where he had put Kenya's body? Did he really want to go down on these charges? Or was he going to stay quiet and take his chances? Somehow, a detective based in Denver was able to work Travis over a series of long interviews, and Travis would ultimately confess, but not without some serious compromises. This included Kenya's stepfather agreeing to a deal that if he confessed to the murder of his stepdaughter, they would take a few things off of the table, including the death penalty. Ditto with Lydia Tillman. If he could confess to that, in that attempted murder case, he could have another deal. And of course, it's a longer and more involved story. But ultimately, they were able to get Travis to not only confess to what he did, but also lead authorities to where he buried Kenya's body. That after he'd killed her, he drove her in his creepy van miles and miles and miles outside of Denver and buried her in a shallow grave where it was unlikely they would ever have found her. And after 5 months of agony, Kenya's stepfather and mother were finally able to take Kenya home. So why did he do it? And what was the connection between these two women? Well, it seems his choices, well, they were more like compulsions. These were just two women who were in the wrong place at the wrong time. In Kenya's case, that was a matter of choosing door number 1 or door number 2. That night that she'd gone out, she chose one nightclub over another. And in one nightclub were her friends waiting for her. And in another nightclub were people she didn't know that well. And it seems she might have been slipped a drug or drank something that she wasn't used to. And she left the club, leaving behind her purse and her phone. This made her a vulnerable target to someone like Travis. Then, just a few months later, in Fort Collins, Colorado, it seemed he did the same thing with Lydia. Saw an attractive woman with long brown hair and started following her, and decided right then and there she would be his next victim. At some point during his sentencing, Travis himself said he needed to be stopped, that he would, if allowed, do this again. There was one bright spot in all of this. Lydia Tillman was out of that coma, and after spending 5 weeks in ICU, she was relocated to a rehabilitation facility that would begin the long road of recovery. This included such an extensive amount of surgery for her jaw. Her brother had to raise $65,000 through a crowdfunding campaign just to cover the cost of that jaw surgery alone. Then there was all of the brain damage from that stroke, among other injuries, where Lydia would have to relearn how to speak all over again. From the basics, from the alphabet, from zero. Her doctors were hopeful, but they were realistic. She likely would never be able to really regain the power of speech again. It was an arduous task, to say the least. And as Dateline producers track this story, it was a dilemma for them making this episode. If Dateline were to abide their editorial policy, they would really need Lydia to speak about what happened to her. For this episode, they had access to Kenya's parents, her mother and stepfather, the detectives, including Detective Shackley, talking about the case. They even had Lydia's sister. But could they get Lydia to agree to be interviewed? It had been 10 months since her attack. Travis Forbes was by then in prison, where he'd likely end up for the rest of his life. Legally, this was over. But for Lydia, the battle raged on. She wasn't sure if she'd be able to put the words together. Could she physically appear on camera and find the words that she wanted to say? Dateline producers don't cajole or persuade people to come on the show. But it would help if Lydia was interviewed by the grace of all time. The only one who could really get Lydia comfortable in talking. Keith Morrison. When Keith sat down in front of Lydia Tillman, he had a job to do. In this room where there were blindingly bright lights, multiple cameras, and who knows how many people watching, he had to make Lydia feel like they were the only two people in that room, the only two in the world. And his producers watched in awe as Keith did just that. But there was a surprise in store for Keith as well. Over the years, Keith had sat in front of hundreds of people, and he'd seen every reaction. Often it was a feeling of anger, a desire for revenge if justice had not been served, and even when justice had been served, a sense of profound residual loss, a trauma that would never go away. But as he sat in front of Lydia Tillman, much to his great surprise, the halting words that she spoke were unlike anything he'd ever really heard before. She told Keith she'd made a choice, and it wasn't a split-second one. Split-second decisions were a luxury Lydia could no longer afford. Every thought she had, every word, had to be carefully thought through and chosen. And this was the hardest decision she ever made, she told Keith. She decided to forgive Travis Forbes. Really forgive Travis Forbes. Keith asked how she could do that after everything he did to her. She believed Travis Forbes did what he did out of fear and hatred. So she made that choice. I chose love and peace over fear, she said. And I won. And it's then in this interview where Lydia gives Keith a gift. It's a bracelet with her name, Lydia. Only, she explained to Keith, Lydia was also an acronym. And she explained slowly that Lydia stood for Live Your Days Inspired Anew. Now Keith, he always let people's stories flow through him. This time he had a lump in his throat. His producer, Robert Dean, would later say there was not a dry eye in that entire room. Even Keith, who was expressive but rarely emotional, even this time, he got choked up. And for the next few years, the producers of Dateline actually stayed in touch with Lydia. And in 2015, they reported that Lydia had made a near full recovery and dedicated her life to helping other survivors of violent crime move past their trauma. She also became friends with the Detective Jackie Shackley. And when Lydia became a certified yoga teacher, Detective Shackley was one of her first clients. And Keith, well, he's been doing great ever since. He eventually got to meet Bill Hader in person, and Bill Hader made it clear that he worshipped Keith Morrison. And Keith need never worry about his credibility again. He is more popular than he's ever been, and there's a demand for true crime forevermore. And maybe one day he'll make the decision to retire. Until then, as long as most people, like to talk, Keith Morrison will always be there, listening. Or will he? And most people, we love to sleep too. So with that, thank you so much for listening to Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime, and I'm going to try and quickly finish maybe one more Morrison episode where it's a cold case and Keith is joined by some of his most prominent friends. It's like a Super Friends episode. And it's an episode where even I, Nancy Miller, make a little cameo. And you'll hear all about it, if I can get it done quickly, next week. Thank you for the opportunity and for your patience and your support. If you get a chance, please follow the show so you don't miss it. Until then, nighty-night.